In Cambridge's almost 200-year-old history, there have been many crime stories.
But one of the most sensational crimes happened in the early years of Ontario.
A crime so salacious, it shocked a nation. Orr Lake is just on the outskirts of Cambridge, but what was then Galt, Ontario.
In the 1800s, the land belonged to Anthony Orr, known as Tony, a prosperous farmer who had a beautiful wife Emma and 3 healthy children. They are well known in town. Emma Orr had been born in 1859, Emily Borland,
to a prominent farm family in Brighton, Ontario.
Beautiful and vivacious with a love of company, she had married young to John Arnold of Innerskip. Sadly, her husband died when she was 22, a tragedy. But the lovely widow didn't stay unmarried. She had no children from her first marriage,
but was soon courted and married again at age 25 to Tony Orr,
a well-to-do farmer 12 years older than her. The farm wasn't in the wilderness, but just a very short ride from Galt, and all the delights of an up-and-coming town could offer: theatre, shopping, and socializing. To be married first to a man with a career, and then to a farmer, could have been looked at as a step down for well-bred Emily.
But it was assumed she followed her heart. In quick succession, they had 2 children.
And to the outside world, all seemed well with the Orrs. But it wasn't.
Emma was a devoted mother, but to her husband she seemed indifferent. Was she regretting the marriage? Didn't matter.
In the 1800s, it would take an act of parliament to get a divorce in Canada, and up until 1867, only 5 divorces had been granted. When you stood in church and vowed till death do you part, you really meant it. Emma knew that the only way to legally get out of this marriage would be the same as the last, if her husband was to die. The Orr farm was large and prosperous,
And as Tony needed help on the farm, he hired a man named Mulholland.
and while Tony was a nervous and excitable man, Mulholland was a good-looking man, strong and attractive enough to catch Emma's eye and make her do an unspeakable thing.
Some rumors are whispered and some rumors are roared, and this rumor spread like wildfire through Galt.
That in 1896, Emma gathered up her then 2 children and ran off with Mulholland, leaving her husband behind, and from the morals of the day, her decency, reputation, and good name as well.
For a married woman to leave her husband to elope with another man was eye-bulging gossip in the day. She was leaving the safety of her home and the protection of her husband to be called a variety of names, hussy being the least of them. The question was she running away from something or to something?
But surprisingly, she didn't stay with Mulholland for very long.
Maybe she realized quite quickly there'd be a big difference between being with a prosperous farmer and a farm laborer.
Maybe the heat of passion wore off quickly. Besides, what prospects would they have had?
Mulholland wouldn't have been able to support her and her 2 children in the manner she'd become accustomed. She never would have been able to marry him, and he wouldn't have been able to get work with anyone who knew that he had absconded with another man's wife. Their only choice would have been to change their names and move far away if they wanted to stay in Canada.
Or to slip over the border to the United States and either concoct a lie that they were married, or for her to claim that she was a widow and marry him and commit bigamy.
Surprisingly, bigamy was a lot more common than you would think in the 1800s. Why stay in a horrible marriage when you could move away and start all over again?
Some claim that her husband Tony managed to follow her to Niagara Falls and coax her to come back to him. Others say she made it easy for Tony to find her and get her out of the mess she had made.
Whatever happened, she ended up returning to the farm with Tony and having a 3rd child together.
Tony hired a new hired hand. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice.
Jim Ellison was young, 17, and he was strong, but he was described as having a face like a frog. There was nothing to attract Emma to this fellow. But Emma was restless. She enjoyed having company, and soon she had some more.
Harry Blair, an agricultural implement dealer from Galt, and also Weldon Sidney Trevani, a medical student who spent the summer in Galt. Both were known to stop by and spend time chatting with Emma and keeping her amused.
While her husband Tony was getting older and duller every day.
On the morning of August 9th, 1897, Tony took his 9-year-old son with him to deliver a hog to a nearby farm, leaving Emma alone with their 10-year-old daughter and their 14-month-old daughter.
But when Tony returned a few hours later, his wife couldn't be found.
The hired hand Jim had been out delivering cows to a nearby neighbor, and when he had returned, the children were outside, unattended.
Had Emma gone off yet again, this time with another man? But her clothes and jewelry were in the house. Her husband went into Galt and accused the medical student of being up to no good with his wife, but the medical student had no idea where Emma was.
Tony Orr contacted Galt Constabulary to report that his wife was missing, but the whispers and the rumors were rampant.
While some speculated she had run off with another man, others wondered if she hadn't done away with herself.
The day before she disappeared, she had been to an Orr family funeral where she had been treated coldly by the clan, and also the hired hand's gun was missing. 2 days passed and a search was made of the property, where a 3-foot deep hole out in the swampy part of the land was found, a hole that was large enough to fit a body. With the find of the hole and no confidence in the local police force, Detective John Wilson Murray from the Toronto Police Force was called out to help with the investigation. Meanwhile, the menfolk of the Orr family descended on the farm for a further search, and Tony's brother John found a mound of dirt in the cornfield, 30 yards from the house. When he prodded with a stick, he unearthed a hand. Emma had been buried in a shallow grave.
Presumably before she'd been taken to the deeper grave in the swamp. She had been both shot and bludgeoned.
And when her body was found, both the medical student and the hired hand were taken into custody in Galt, while the agricultural implement dealer, Harry Blair, was kept under surveillance.
And Tony had fallen under suspicion. Had the husband faked his concern?
How could her body not be found sooner when it was so close to the house? Did he have an accomplice that failed to follow through on the plan to bury her in the dugout grave and resorted to quickly bury her in the cornfield?
News of the found body and rumors hit the town of Galt, and the local newspaper printed every grisly detail, and the story was picked up by newspapers across Canada.
The local townsfolk descended on the farm in morbid curiosity. It's thought that over 100 people came out to ghoulishly gawk at the farm to try to see where the body was discovered, and trampling over any evidence that might have been found. Meanwhile, all the suspected men were trying to establish their alibis. The hired hand Jim was under deeper suspicion when neighbors claimed that they had seen him delivering cows much later than he had claimed, giving him ample opportunity to commit the crime. Jim's gun had also been found hidden behind the barn. With Jim Allison in custody, the detective from Toronto, John Wilson Murray, arrived in Galt and immediately began interrogating him with the Galt police chief. Jim was only 17 at the time, and confusingly told rambling stories, including the claim that he had seen a man with a red mustache lurking by the farm,
and that Emma had asked to see Jim's gun. But after 5 hours of interrogation, with no access to a lawyer, Jim finally confessed to the murder of Emma Borland. The newspapers went wild with the story, printing whatever speculation they wanted about the motive. Emma's name was dragged through the mud.
But some printed that she continued to attract and welcome improper attention from other men. The newspapers reported that she was a woman with a reputation.
With such a woman, why would anybody be surprised that a young man would make advances to her, and when rebuffed, to lash out and kill her?
The trial lasted 2 days. The judge censored the police for interrogating Jim for 5 hours with no lawyer present, but let the confession stand. Neighbors claimed that Jim had not been delivering cows when he claimed to be, and that they had heard a gunshot at 8 in the morning. The defense countered.
They said that the timing was suspect, Jim had no scratches or other marks on him, there had been no sign of a struggle at the farm, and the Crown had failed to provide the evidence of motive, only speculation.
The jury deliberated for 3 hours before finding Jim guilty. The presiding judge noted that the evidence was purely circumstantial, and the jury might have come to a different conclusion. But, as was the law at the time, the judge sentenced Jim Allison to death for the murder of Emma Orr.
Was there enough evidence that Jim had killed Emma? Or was an innocent man about to be hung for something that someone else had done? Controversy swirled, and eyes were on Emma's husband. Was he about to get away with murder while framing someone else?
And then, in the days before his execution, Jim Allison asked to see the governor of the jail, Jonathan Cook, and confessed his crime to him.
He wanted to make it clear that there was no lascivious motives in Emma's death. He had done it out of anger. He had been denied an outing to Niagara Falls, and he was bitter about it.
He dug a grave in the swamp days before, and on the day of the murder he had loaded the gun, done some chores, and shot Emma Orr as she was milking. He then took an axe and struck her on the head with it. He thought the swamp grave was too far off for him to quickly bury her, so he dug a second shallow grave in the cornfield with the intent of burying her properly later. He hid the gun and tidied up the dirt around her shallow grave, and then got back to his work.
Jim Allison was hung in the courtyard of the Waterloo County Gaol, February 4th, 1998, and to the end he always insisted that he had never made any improper advances to Mrs. Orr.